So it's just a heads up on that. And I am going to, share my screen. So you should be able to see coming up on your screen, right? You should be able to see my screen that has From Flowers to Feathers, right? Very good.
Yeah.
And of course, by the way,
Got
yeah,
it.
there you go. Yeah, you can always use, I love the reactions. If you look on your Zoom, you have a reactions tab, and you can give me a thumbs up or a hand clap, or just there's all kinds of fun. There you go. So it's just all kinds of fun things to do with Zoom, in terms of using that those little visual icons. So anyway, thank you for joining us here today. And we're going to run through this presentation here, which I've really enjoyed preparing and I've really enjoyed delivering. This is actually I actually started this work back in 2018 and started delivering versions of this presentation in 2019. And it is interesting noting how far ahead I was scheduled for this meeting today. My laptop gave me a calendar reminder this morning of getting ready to drive to Hoquiam. So it was well pre-COVID before we had all scheduled this. Yes. Okay. So to that point, then let's just begin. A reminder that today's presentation, I'm making it all available, and it's on this URL, and we can publish this URL later. But if you want to take note of this URL now, or you can actually download the whole presentation or go see this online if you want. It's tinyurl. That's TINYURL, tinyurl.com. And I made the name GSAS, October 2020. So tinyurl.com/GSAS October 2020. Okay. And again, this is we can go through this as we go through. Now, the fun title, of course, is From Flowers to Feathers. The official title, of course, the scientific title that we're talking, Reconciliation Ecology. So this is Michael Rosenvig did a seminal article in 2003. And in which he defines reconciliation ecology as redesigning anthropogenic habitats so that their use is compatible with use by a broad array of species. So that's a huge mouthful. But what we're talking about here, of course, is figuring out how we work within man-touched environments, anthropogenic, man-touched habitats, so that their use is compatible by the rest of nature. So with reconciliation ecology as our theme, here's another concept to be introduced today called the third landscape. This is introduced by Gilles Clement. And this species speaks to the sum of all human disturbed land through which natural processes still occur. And this is significant to note here, by the way, in that human disturbed land is everything upon which you and I are speaking today. Our homes, our landscapes, our gardens, these are human disturbed landscapes. But however, natural processes are still occurring. And what we can do, as noted in that quote there, this is a privileged area of receptivity to biological diversity. So my theme and thrust today is that we can work within the landscapes that we have adjusted and made changes to make them better for the world, better for the climate, better for humanity. So to that point, we ask, of course, why is this important to us? And specifically, why is this important to the Grays Harbor Audubon Society? There are about 1,000 bird species in the lower 48. It's interesting what bird list you actually want to check. Some say 900 something, some say 1,200. And of course, once you start counting Canada and Alaska in terms of North America, your count goes up to maybe 1,500. But in the lower 48, about 1,000 bird species, nearly half are at risk of extinction. Now that's sobering, incredibly sobering when you think about this.
That's terrible.
That is terrible when you reflect upon this. And again, this is indeed what we all can make impact. And I specifically mean, I want to go through this continual enthusiasm here today to be optimistic and positive in that what we're going to be talking about today are things we all can do to make this planet better, no matter how small or how large your landscapes might be. Now, there's a bunch of resources here. You don't have to make any copies here. These will all be in the presentation, which I indicated is online. And so again, I'll repeat that URL once we get once we get later in the presentation. So, but there's a lot of great resources that are out there, including, I might add, including an article in today's New York Times print edition. And we'll get to that because it is interesting. This is fall time. It's time to clean up the landscapes. There's actually there's a very important and very valuable article in today's New York Times. It's on the digital Times as well. And we'll be talking about that as we get through, as we get later in the presentation. Now, the topic we're talking about has been a topic of interest for a long time. I mean, look at that, 1899. This publication, Our Native Birds, How to Protect Them and Attract Them to Our Homes, 1899. Look at this, 1907, Useful Birds and Their Protection, and this 1910, Methods of Attracting Birds. It is interesting that some of these publications, by the way, especially this Useful Birds and Their Protection, I have a copy of that book. And in the book, by the way, it talks about how to use strychnine to kill unwanted sparrows and how to use arsenic to kill cats. So I tell you, we were much more liberal with our poisons, 100 years ago than we certainly are today, with good reason. But at any rate, I encourage you to do a little poking around to some of these old texts. It's fascinating to think about how long bird lovers have been caring about this topic. Now, if nothing else from today, these topics, 4 basic needs of birds: food, water, cover, and space. Food, water, cover, and space. There'll be a quiz later on this. Across different vegetation layers, your ground, your shrub, your lower canopy, and your upper canopy. So if nothing else, think about 4 basic needs across 4 vegetation layers, ground all the way up to your upper canopy. If nothing else, also think about what you're doing with your lawn. We're going to be talking about lawn area today. Lawns today are nearly 3% of the entire United States, and they are the least valuable habitat for any kind of wildlife. Also, and this is very specific to us in Grays Harbor and in Pacific counties where I'm at, respect the shoreline buffers and your critical area buffers. These are buffers for wetlands. And I tell you, in our 2 counties, our 3,500 square miles, I tell you, we have a lot of wetlands. We have a lot of critical areas. These are incredibly valuable habitats for wildlife. Respect those. Both Grays Harbor and Pacific counties have strong shoreline management programs. These are ordinances that require us to respect the vegetation around these critical areas. And oh, by the way, if you're involved in an ag area, there's a new program that the Washington legislature just introduced in the last couple of years. And this is the Voluntary Stewardship Program. And your conservation district can speak to you more about that. I'll also make a pitch for master gardeners, as Terry and Michael and Arnie and Jude, are well known. We talk a lot about these topics as part of the Master Gardener program. We just completed our 2020 training. And hopefully by 2022, we'll be able to conduct in-person training, although we did a very successful 2020 training virtually. Okay, a couple of definitions as we get into this thing, and I don't want to get too hung up upon terms, but I want to there we go. We have an opportunity to think about some definitions here. A weed is simply an undesirable or troublesome plant. A wildflower, obviously a flower that grows in the wild. I love Lady Bird Johnson's definition of a wildflower, right? A wildflower simply that it would say a weed without a press agent. So we'll talk more about weeds. The ornamental. cultivated for decorative purposes, and herbaceous, leaves that die down at the end of the growing season. You know, that would be a good idea. Hang on a second. Let me just take a quick pause here. Where's my menu controls here? I can post something in chat. Where's my little controls here? My apologies. I'm trying to find the. I'm going to stop the screen sharing just for a second here so that I can get into chat and send a message here to on the URL if you guys want to copy along here. Tiny URL / GHAS October 2020. There you go. Very good. Go back to sharing my screen. Okay. Apologize for that. Just wanted to clean that. Just wanted to clean that up a little bit. Now, with respect to definitions here, another page here of exotic. We're going to be talking about this closely here. Exotic plants of a foreign origin or character, not native. And we're going to be talking a lot about exotic plants. And I want to make sure that we understand the difference between those versus invasive plants and noxious plants. And there are specific definitions for invasive and noxious that actually are codified into Washington state law. So there are Washington RCWs that actually talk about these terms. And my point about going to these definitions is not to get too cerebral or too academic, but to make sure that we're communicating clearly as to what we're talking about when we start talking about these. So I want to do a shout out to the Noxious Weed Board because we have a definition of what noxious means, and that's a legal term for an invasive, non-native that threatens ag, local ecosystems, or fish and wildlife. Note here is a key point. A half of all invasive and noxious weeds are escapees from our gardens. So this is a very significant point to make note of here, is that when we plant something exotic or something alien to our natural ecosystem, we are at risk of having the seeds from that be spread either by wind or by birds, or even just, or as you say here in the note here, through travel and trade. So this is a strong call to be conscious about what we're planting into our gardens, noting that what we plant in our gardens may go beyond our landscape's borders through no fault of our own. Shout out here for the website for the Noxious Weed Control Board. I encourage you all to visit. By the way, it's a great site, and they have a lot of great references here relative to what is a noxious weeds, how to identify noxious weeds in plants, what to do about them, and where to get assistance at the state level or at the local conservation district level to control your noxious weeds. So that's nwcb.wa.gov. Now, a big theme we're going to be seeing here today is about planting natives and working with native plants. An author that I want to bring all of you to make sure that to hopefully encourage you to add to your bookshelves is Doug Tallamy. Doug Tallamy teaches environmental sciences at the University of Delaware. He is an outstanding speaker. He is stridently pro-ecosystem and has authored a number of books that are very easily, very accessible and very easily gained in terms of knowledge. He makes a strong point here. He makes a strong point in this 2007 book, right? If you can't be sure about where a particular plant, what the future behavior of that plant's going to be relative to how it spreads seeds, the safe and responsible course of action is the most unpopular one. Limit its use. You can never be absolutely sure that all the seed from a fertile plant is staying in our gardens. Those of us in Grays Harbor and Pacific counties are well aware of the issues of invasive species. I'm reminded you all may remember that back in the 1860s, there was a hard freeze that killed most of the oysters that were in Grays Harbor and Willapa Bay. In an effort to
Wow.
repopulate those oysters, there was oyster spat that was taken from Chesapeake Bay, the eastern oyster, that was transported over to both of our Grays Harbor and Willapa Bay. They planted those eastern oysters in the bay, not knowing that the packing material used for those oyster seeds was Spartina altiflora. It's
Oh
a
my
broadleaf
gosh.
grass. Between 1860 and 2005, over 15,000 acres across our two bays were infested with this cordgrass. This cordgrass spreads not only from seed, but also from rhizome. And the real issue with this grass is that it takes the mud flats of our bays and it turns them into sod, hard sod. And how do you think the shorebirds, who depend upon the soft mud to get their nematodes and their other feeding done, they cannot penetrate that hard sod. So I tell you, it's by the way, the eradication of Spartina has been a great success. This is a combination of federal, state, county, and local efforts. We are indeed now down to eliminating the last few plants, not just acres, but the last few plants. We estimate there's less than a half acre total across our two bays. This is a tremendous success story, but you can realize the risk that happens once you bring an exotic alien plant into an ecosystem in which it was not intended. Now, native. A native plant or animal is one that has evolved to a particular place to establish specialized relationships that are nature. Now, think about that. It's a plant or animal that's evolved specialized relationships that allow it to exist in a particular ecosystem. This becomes very significant when we think about native plants that not only, that you can see here in the quote, they accrue from origin, evolution, and functionality. I want to make a strong point that they can be showy plants, as you see here from the salal, the Kinnikinnick, the sword fern, the pearly everlasting, and the yarrow. This point about connections of these native plants is significant in that they've evolved to have specialized relationships with other organisms, either insects or microbes in their ecosystem. So when we talk about a native plant, it really can be very native to a very small ecosystem because of its evolutionary connection. And here's the key point. Let's bring it back to birds here. Most insects can only eat plants for which they share an evolutionary history. Now, here's the key. If you lose the insects, you lose the birds. This is a strong point here in which we think about bird feeders and we think about what we do in terms of suet, and we think about what we think about in terms of special plants. But so much of this comes down to including natives in our gardens so that they create insects that can be used as food and forage for our birds. Now, insects, 90% of these are discriminating foodies, right? They can digest only the vegetation that they evolved alongside. And look at what the Missouri Botanical Garden says. You lose a plant, you lose a native plant, you might take around 10 to 30 species of higher order insects and animals with it. Point being is that every native plant has relationships with its insects, and the relationships with its insects then to translation with relationships with birds. To that point, we relate here, Michael, you have a question?
Well, yeah, I did on that whole native thing. So I understand from the plant's viewpoint that it can come, let's say something is not native to Washington, but say it comes from Oregon and it shares the same type of soil and that sort of thing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it carries the vegetation that's necessary for the survival of that species, right? I don't know if I'm framing it right, but because, okay, So this came from a marsh. Oh, there's marshes in Washington, but there's other things around that it depends on besides the land, right?
This is exactly the key point here, is that going back to this point, is that the Oregon silver spot butterfly, and it's the Oregon silver spot butterfly is native to both Oregon and Washington. It feeds on only a particular kind of violet, Viola adunca. One critical butterfly feeds only on one type of violet. And you've got to have sufficient quantities of that violet, no matter across the entire area upon which that butterfly needs in order for that butterfly to survive.
Right.
And so the challenge here, I know that here in Pacific County and Willapa National Wildlife Refuge, we're trying to restore acreages of this Viola adunca with the hope that we can release some of the butterflies that are being grown by the Portland Zoo, by the way, and release those back into the native. But exactly to your point, Michael, is that you get into a situation here in which you really got to stress in terms of having sufficient habitat and sufficient matches between the kind of foliage and the insects and birds that need upon them. Now, this point about insects is something that I found that was a remarkable learning for myself, in that baby birds depend upon insects as a primary characteristics. I want to jump into this thing. Where did I go to this thing? Is it because I'm trying to get ahead here too. This is the yeah, okay, I'll come back to this later. So this is the and yeah, so I'm going to come back to this this concept of insects and baby birds in a bit later here. The point being is that baby birds cannot digest seeds. So when you put out seeds and bird seed, that's not useful for baby birds. It's too hard for their digestive systems. They depend upon soft-shelled organisms, and I'm going to be talking about some important studies that talk about the thousands of caterpillars that are actually needed to support baby birds as we get into this. And I neglected where I put those slides in my presentation, so we'll come back to that in a moment. So a big shout out here for weeds. Ralph Waldo Emerson, a weed is a plant whose virtues have yet to be discovered. So from those of us in the gardening realm, right, let's not be so quick, right, to talk about, the evils of weeds, right? Because even that great poet Emerson, right, has qualities for these. In fact, Doug Tallamy talks about that weeds may have a marketing problem. If we weren't talking about milkweed or pokeweed or ragweed, right, we could be talking about milkweed as monarch's delight. And why is milkweed so important for the monarch butterfly? Because it's the only plant that the monarch butterfly feeds on, is the milkweed, right? So again, if we could, just rename them, maybe we'd have a better chance. So my final comment on natives, by the way, is that Washington Native Plant Society has some great native plant list. WNPS.org. You can go county by county and get the native plant list for your counties, and make your selections from there. So the point from a gardening standpoint is that we really want to emphasize natives for the strong reasons about the connections that native plants have with the insects that are needed to feed upon them. Now, a couple of other URLs, by the way. Audubon has some great resources for Plant for Birds. Native plant database, grownative.org. They're out of Missouri, but they've got a great database and a great online database for plant selections. And at the National Wildlife Foundation, nwf.org, has a native plant finder that's very helpful. So again, native plant, just even searching for native plants, right, on it in your area, you'll find all kinds of resources. So this is it's one of these. There should be no excuses, no excuses for not knowing what native plants can be available. And again, I want to reiterate that native plants can be quite attractive. You don't need to go all exotic to have a beautiful, showy garden. Another URL, by the way, that I'll refer to as we get through the presentation is WSU's own gardening site, gardening.wsu.edu. every master gardener knows this is the go-to site for Washington Master Gardeners, gardening.wsu.edu, all kinds of information in this. And I tell you, it is interesting as a master gardener, even during this period of COVID quarantine, we get about 1 or 2 calls a week from new people that are moving out of Seattle and Portland, that are moving into our regions here in Grays Harbor and Pacific County, and they're asking for, what do I grow here? What do I do here? It's a lot different from Portland and Seattle, where I came from. And it's easy just to direct them to this site and let them go to town, because there's tremendous amount of information, very accessible in this regard. Now, final point on native plants. 5% of our native plants support 75% of the food web. Think about that. It's not a question then of native versus non-native. This is the key point that Doug Tallamy wants to get point. It's a question of functionality. What does that native plant do relative to providing food for birds and nurturing for insects, and consequently nurturing for ourselves? So when you're thinking about plant choices for your garden, we encourage you to think about what's interesting to the ecosystem, beyond as saying what might be interesting to you, the next newest showest plant. So back to the key point, 4 basic needs, right? Food, water, cover, and space. I'll emphasize that no matter how large or small your acreage in your garden and your landscape is, even if you've got a terrace balcony in a condo, you can take advantage of these 4 basic needs to do something positive for the birds in your life here. Let's begin with food. Especially in year 1, 80% mortality across nature is common. That's a tragic figure, of course, as we think about it in human terms. But in nature, think about 80% of wildlife dies in its first year. We have a heron rookery here on the property. I have 10 acres here in Pacific County. I have a heron rookery here. So each year we have about 80 nesting birds. We have an eagle's nest right next door. We have a coyote den right underneath, right? We have ravens, right, that prey upon the eggs. It's a tough world out there in the rookery, let me tell you. But year after year, and we know that this rookery has been there for maybe 75 years, long before we had the house and the property here. But these heron have figured out that you stick with it, right, and you can have a productive child rearing habitat. To that point, we can do our part in helping birds have better chances in that first year if, as you think of your plants as bird feeders, as suggested by Doug Tallamy. Your goal, create a foraging hub in your landscape. Think about these trees and these shrubs that provide homes for insects as well as for adult birds. We'll talk about this. Now, when I talk about willow, cherry, oak, I'm talking about species of trees that are keystone species that actually provide tremendous value of insect habitat. And you can find these lists, by the way. This is that, and they typically classify these lists as how many species of moths and caterpillars and butterflies they nurture. If you notice here, look at the oaks, the Quercus family. The oaks, over 900 species of moths and caterpillars are hosted by oak trees. Who knew? You know, willows are very important to our environment here, by the way. Willows, very important. And they host nearly 700 species. And so this is what I mean when I talk about a keystone species. This is a species of plant. If that species were not here, dramatic changes in the ecosystem would be consequential. So it's fascinating when you start thinking about the comments on this. So these lists, by the way, again, best plants, Tallamy. If you do a search on that, you'll find up these lists. You can see, by the way, that sunflowers, violets, right, native viburnums, some great opportunities here. Some great opportunities to see these, to take advantage of some of these. clover, native grasses. Again, this will be in the handouts, right? So you'll be able to think about, what you can be doing here on your own property in terms of these best plants. Okay. Dean marriage. Dean marriage has, this is dates, the list is dated from 1976, so it's a little older, but it's far more specific as to what kind of birds like what kind of plants. And so it's a very interesting list to look at relative to, relative to picking a type of plant you can work with and a type of bird you may want to attract. So that becomes a fascinating, study just to think about. Well, geez, if you enjoy seeing woodpeckers, flickers, what kind of plants might you want to grow there? If you want to see sparrows, if you want to see it finches, what kind of plants might be best for those? So if you look for Dean marriage, do a search on that. Yeah, Michael.
Not all birds prefer the same colors, and I was wondering if you had any insight as to why that is.
It is fascinating on colors, by the way. Birds see more colors than we do.
Yeah, I know.
Birds have an additional color rod in their retina. We only have 3. Hummingbirds have 4. Some birds have even more than that. So they can see ultraviolet light. They can see different shades and have a far finer discernment of color than we do. So that is.
Well, I know that's really true with chickens, and the way they pack the neurons in their eyes. I mean, I was just wondering why. Has there been any studies showing that, okay, these birds develop this color preference because and their eyes because of the available flowers to them, or is it just, I mean, like the bees and the orchids or something like that? I mean, has there been any correlation between coevolution? I mean, like the birds that produce blue is because there've been blue flowers?
That I don't know. That would be fascinating, by the way, if you actually removed some color rods, right, from a bird, and then seeing how that would respond. But of course, Michael, you're thinking about the deep, dark side of things. That's for sure. The Frankenstein side of things. That's for sure. I'd like to see you champion that experiment. Yes,
I will.
Now, a couple key points. So, power foods. Ken Beavis, by the way, Ken Beavis is with Washington Department of Natural Resources. Ken does a talk on native plants and native landscapes, and he uses the word power foods. And the power foods he choose are, you can see, often end with berry. Often a berry type, and that's kind of common. You would expect that, right? Is it the blueberries, the blackberries, the raspberry, anything with a berry, right? We know those birds love berry trees. You might not think about some of the other bayberries or elderberries, very bitter sorts of things. But those are huge power foods, especially in the winter, as we get into these things. Now, I want to come back to insects here, and I want to repeat this insects here, is that 80 to 90% of the plants we do grow require pollination. And this is a frightening thought. Think about a world without insects is a world without 96% of the terrestrial bird species that we depend upon. And you notice he's talking about terrestrial bird species as opposed to aquatic and pelagic birds, right? Which have a whole different, ecosystem going on here. But the emphasis I'm going here is that building your landscape as valuable for insects will mean it is valuable for birds. And consequently, is valuable for birds, it's valuable for us too. So all of what we're talking about today in terms of improving the quality of your landscape is improving the quality of the landscape for us, for human existence, as well as for birds, as well as for insects. Now, I teed this up earlier, right? Is that this Richard Brewer in 1961, this is a huge study, a very important study. A chickadee pair brings almost 600 caterpillars to the nest every day for over 2 weeks to feed their young. So this is an incredibly, and I was stunned at that statistic. And you just think about a pair of chickadees have to bring that many caterpillars because the baby chicks need soft shelled. So they need caterpillars or spiders, something with a softer exoskeleton that they can that they can digest before they fledge the nest. And so it's a huge thinking in terms of why those keystone species that I was referring to earlier are so significant. Why it's important to have the willows, the oaks, the cherries that host hundreds of different kinds of species. This Doug Tallamy did a similar study, by the way, in about 5 years ago. He saw that this common yellow throat made 150. He counted 100, nearly 160 foraging trips each day. He wasn't able to count how many insects the foragers were bringing back to the nest. But those parents are busy. I tell you, they're busy, and this goes on obviously for a couple of weeks, right? Until the birds have a chance to fledge. But again, I encourage you to reference this Brewer study from 1961. It's an older study, but it's a peer-reviewed study that's really held the test of time in terms of its strength of showing how important these caterpillars are for young birds. Now, while we're talking about food, feeders. All of us have bird feeders, I dare say, right? I'm looking at mine now out the window, and this is important that we recognize, of course, that that bird feeders can be a trick. They can trick birds into collisions with windows. It's so important, as we all know, to break up window reflections. I had a recent experience here in which a family of flickers fledged, and we had 4 babies on top of the bird feeder, along with mom, who was teaching them how to get suet out of the suet feeder. Well, along came a merlin. Dashed out of a nearby conifer, got one of the babies. Everybody else scrammed, right? One of the babies flew right into my window, and broke its neck. And this is even with all the netting that I have, here trying to break up that visual display. So Audubon clearly suggests that you position your feeders either within 30 feet of your home or 30 feet further away from your windows. Now, mind you, my feeders are indeed within that 30-foot range, and it's just tough when it's raptor, bird on bird, bird on bird violence, right? It's just, it's a tough thing to do here. One of the comments that I'll make, however, is that in terms of window reflections, I've picked up on what you, Michael, were saying here, is that because birds can see different colors, I actually have an old pink yoga mat of my wife, an old pink yoga mat, and I cut strips of that yoga mat, and I hang those strips down from the eaves near windows that are close to my feeders. And I'm finding that seems to help because the strips they move in the wind, so they give the birds something to focus on, right? So they give the bird something to focus on as opposed to the reflection in the window. I also use blackberry netting, blueberry, just bird netting, right? That plastic bird netting you might put around your blueberry bushes. I hang strips of that from my eaves, and that's been very effective. Although I have to admit, I've caught a few small bats that get caught up in those, but they're easy to dislodge. So again, this is a significant point about moving the bird feeders further away or near to your home. Hummingbird feeders, quick comment on those, of course. They need to be positioned away from other, as we all know, is that the hummers may like to check out the other bird feeders, but they want their own space. And again, a quick comment about the homemade nectar as opposed to it. And again, this is something from when I'm talking to a birding group. Obviously, there's no need to reiterate these tips, but I am surprised by how many non-birding groups ask about how to create an appealing hummingbird nectar. So I'm curious as to why that is that's consistently asked when I give the presentation to non-birding groups. Now, water. So food and water, some kind of water nearby, no matter how humble, makes a huge difference. I had no idea how much more bird activity I could introduce into my landscape by adding a simple water feature. And I'm telling you, these are my pictures, right? And I'm talking about just using upturned garbage can lids. Upturned garbage can lids properly placed can be quite interesting to a whole different variety of birds. And what I found, by the way, is that the birds sparrows in particular, they like the bottoms of these plant containers, these drip pans for plant containers. They love splashing around in those on the ground. The larger birds, the jays and the banded pigeons, and they like using the garbage pans that are the garbage pails that are up a little higher. So do the larger birds, the flickers. But I encourage you, noting that you don't have to get fancy with your bird watering devices in order to have effective use. So knee deep, that's the key point. It doesn't have to be deep. Birds only like to they'll want to get their feet wet, but they're not, these aren't diving ducks, right? We're talking about, they want to get in there and splash around, right? So they want to dampen the plumage evenly. They don't want to be soaked or be waterlogged. And it is interesting, of course, when they're in the bird bath, cleaning themselves, shaking themselves around, they're very attentive for any prey that might be around. They're very attentive. They realize how vulnerable they are when their plumage is wet. So, hey, under 3 inches is all you need. And the bottom of the base, rough, non-slip surface. I found, by the way, that when I use a garbage can lid, like these plastic lids you see on this presentation here, I found that I need to rough up the bottom of the surface, or maybe put some gravel down there so that they can get a grip. They can get a better grip. The slick surfaces do not seem to work as effective. Okay. Now, also think about where you want to put those watering devices. Near cover. You'll have much more. The picture to the far right. That's a watering bird bath that we have. That's on our property, and you can see I've got it nestled amongst rhododendrons and evergreen huckleberry. And I found the birds perch. They perch in that rhododendron, and they'll come down, take a drink, go back and perch. Go down, take a drink, go back and perch. So the idea of having water that is near cover will, as opposed to out in the open, will truly enhance your watering experience. Bird bath hygiene, they flush and scrub as needed. Audubon recommends cleaning those bird baths, 1 part vinegar and 9 parts water. So this is I'm often asked this in terms of how to clean the bird bath, especially during a hot summer. Of course, you see a lot of algae buildup. So Audubon recommends a little vinegar as part of the cleaning solution, nothing else. So notice that they're recommending a natural vinegar solution as opposed to another soap, and certainly a non-bleach solution. Now, for fun, a permanent water feature. I tell you, if you got the space and you can add a permanent pond, then you can really start attracting some very interesting birds, including ducks and including heron. So this is perhaps a little bit ambitious. If you're living in a condo and you simply have a small patio to add a permanent water feature. But if you have the opportunity, as Terry, you do with your extensive acreage out there, there's no reason why you shouldn't be thinking about a permanent water feature. Now, for fun, a solar powered fountain, I tell you, $10. I have one of these in a couple bird baths, and it's a lot of fun to watch the hummingbirds come through and drink from the fountain as it shoots up. And you'll find other little birds, the nuthatches and the chickadees will fly through it to get wet. So it's a fun thing, and it's solar powered, right? So it's easy to work with, cheap. We don't have to worry too much about this here. Those of you in eastern part of Grace Harbor County may certainly do get extended periods of freeze. And you can keep those just a heated pet. But there's outdoor dog dishes, outdoor dog water dishes that can be plugged in and make sure your water doesn't freeze. And again, you can see they're not expensive. So there's all kinds of, there's no excuse for it. There's no reason to have to freak out over having it frozen water during the winter. And I assure you that providing fresh water during the winter you will open your eyes to a huge number of new bird species you probably didn't even know were in your neighborhood. And it's fascinating watching birds in winter take advantage of the watering devices. Now, be aware, Felis catus, right? And you got to love a bird bath that has the cat with the snorkel in it, right? This is I would love to, I'd love to have that bird bath. I love the picture, I don't know where it's at. And of course, you got to love the cat that's sitting in the bird bath on the far right there. So so it is important if you have cats that are around, this is another caution, in terms of, can you fence the cats out so that the birds can have a safe experience? Can you try to limit your feral cats, etc.? I encourage you not to follow the advice of that 1907 book I was mentioning earlier of using strychnine and arsenic to poison these cats. So we've indeed learned a little bit more humane treatment of our feral cats and our wild cats in the last 100 years. Okay, food, water, cover. Food as a necessary component, water, and now cover. To nest, to roost, and to claim. This is where I get on our lawn rant. 40 million acres of America is in turf grass. That's 2% of the entire land mass of the United States, 8 times the size of New Jersey. The least productive habitat for wildlife. I love the quote here: you can't run a supermarket on just bread, and you can't run an ecosystem on just lawn. Look at this, Julie Sickafus is far more straightforward. The suburban lawn is a wasteland for most wildlife. Most grasses are cut down before the opportunity to flower and go to seed. This was an interesting point, by the way, is that I keep for lawn only the area that is over our septic field. I let that lawn go pretty wild during the summertime. I let it grow until the grasses actually flower. And what I find, this is fascinating, what I found when the grasses go that long and you have the little tiny flowers on the tops of those grasses, you see an abundance of new insects, an abundance of tiny little insects that are taking advantage of just those tiny little grass flowers. I had no idea. And I'm very and of course, I'm having to cut the grass less. So, hey, it's a double win. So my point about lawn is to reduce it if you can and replace it with vertically diverse vegetation. Increase your shrub and your tree cover, especially if your landscape is far removed from a forest. Wildlife seeks out vertical spaces for food and shelter. So some ideas. Even if you have limited space, even if you're in a condo or an apartment with just a small balcony area, think trellis. Think a container and a trellised vine going up that container in that trellising. There's all kinds of interesting vertical plant life that you can work with that will become very attractive, as you can see here. Roses, honeysuckles, grape, hydrangeas, clematis, wisteria. Look at the value you can have by these very attractive plants in very narrow spaces. And look at all the ideas for trellising that you can work with here. These images here, and you can find all kinds of images on the web, by the way, should give you inspiration that no matter how small your area is or may be, you can create interesting trellised environments that have a bunch of activity. Now, we move on to space, food, water, cover, and space. This is kind of an oh duh statement from Alexander Humboldt, from whom Humboldt State University is named, by the way. Larger areas, he observed, larger areas contain more species than do small ones. Larger areas contain more species. It's kind of an oh duh, we say, but I tell you, 100 years later, that's been refined into a law. Species area relationships is an ecological law, and it's mathematically been modeled to show how different species and numbers of species, right, will depend upon how much area they have to work with. This goes for plants as well as for birds, as well as for mammals and other creatures. So the more space we can provide for our bird friends, right, the more species we can attract and maintain. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology, though, speaks to the concern we have about unconnected areas. And there's an initiative that they have called Yard Map to try to connect habitats. And this gets into where we, together with our neighbors, can make a bigger difference. We, working with our neighbors, can create connected habitats. And this is something that we want to get to here, is that how we can improve habitat connections. Look at this, so this fragmented forest upon which most of us have to, most of what we see today in the managed forest of our counties is has huge areas in which the forest has been chopped up. Pacific County, by the way, where I'm at, 70% of our land mass is forest. 70% of our county is forested timberland. And you don't have to look very far, right, to see all kinds of 40-acre and 80-acre tracts that have been clear cut. That fragmentation poses a challenge for birds, migrating and otherwise. Interesting enough, by the way, so a couple resources, eBird.org. I'm presuming that most of us are aware of it. Most of the non-birding groups from which I talk to are not aware of it. But eBird.org does a great job of mapping out what birds you should be seeing in your area. I actually spotted a ruffed grouse in my driveway yesterday. Yesterday, a ruffed grouse popped into my driveway. I was surprised as heck to see it. She was surprised to see me, by the way. And so I went on eBird.org this morning to verify that, yes, indeed, it's not a hot spot for a ruffed grouse, but it's not that uncommon, where you can see the little red arrow is marking where I'm at. And there's actually some great hot spots up there in Grays Harbor. You can see that which the ruffed grouse should be very common this time of year. So a shout out here for eBird in terms of when you're thinking about the types of birds you may want to attract, go to eBird and actually put in species, and you actually can see what kind of birds you should be seeing at what time of years. So again, this tremendous science that's available, citizen science, mind you, that's available to you via these tools. And again, as you can see from this, this also eBird I checked, is that the ruffed grouse, it should be pretty common. It's not uncommon that I should be seeing it in October here in the Pacific Northwest. And there's other species, of course, that are going to be far less common. But again, a shout out for eBird. So at this point, we've covered the basics: food, water, shelter, and cover. We're ready to plant. Key encouragement: the plantings we want to put into our landscape should be plantings that should provide for all seasons and all types of different food and coverage products. As master gardeners, one of the first things we're taught, of course, is right plant, right place.
Yeah.
And of course, this picture shows that what you plant there is going to grow. So be a little careful about that spruce tree or that redwood that you plant in your front yard, right? Because over the course of time, it will grow. To that point, though, so there's a reminder, by the way, and this that you can see on arborday.org. There's all kinds of references here just to remember that plants grow. And of course, my wife is always reminding me, remember what that plant's going to grow like when it's an adult. I tend to ignore her And that what I'll typically do is I'll just move the plant, right? I'll just move the plant when it gets too big. And I'll be doing some of that today with some twinberry and some mock orange that's gotten too large for their spots. I'll just dig them up and move it. That's one of the great things about being a master gardener. You're not afraid to work in the landscape, right, and make major adjustments. But a key recommendation here in terms of the right plant, right place. Step one, of course, get to know your site. Your site may be large, it may be small, but get to know it. Map it out. Talk about what kind of eco microclimates you may have in your yard. And I really emphasize that when you start thinking about your yard and your landscape, you will know that you have some unique microclimates in your garden, in your yard. You may have morning sun, you may have full sun, you may have some sun that some parts of the garden that bake, during the summertime. You may have well-drained areas, you may have soggy areas. You're certainly going to have shady areas if you've got any trees nearby. Think about wind conditions, sun conditions, soil conditions that may exist in all different parts of your garden area. Map it out and think about how to work the plants into those areas that you may want to work with. Then think about what's lacking in each of those areas. Think about these 4 conditions: food, water, shelter, space. How might you improve on these 4 characteristics in each of those microclimate areas? And then you, of course, think up and down. Think what kind of plants you want to put at the ground layer, what kind of plants you might work at the shrub layer. Think about what kind of plants work in your canopy layers. This is a very useful map, by the way, at zoos are for the birds. Zoos are for the birds.org. Zoos are for the birds.org. And it shows what kind of birds prefer what kind of level, what kind of layer of habitat to work with. And then finally, of course, relate plants to place. You've got to recognize, of course, that you don't exist in a vacuum. You exist in a neighborhood, you exist in a forest habitat. You have to think about putting plants into your habitat that are appropriate to what you can grow. This is a very important quote here: to accept the environmental constraints of a given site. Enhance to a more limited palette of plants that will tolerate and thrive in these conditions. This goes back to my point about planting natives. Planting natives that work in your environment are going to be easier to grow and a lot easier to maintain. Trying to plant an environment that isn't appropriate for those plants, you're going to struggle. And why work that hard? Now, the comment here is, of course, imitate natural settings. Look at what kind of native plants are growing in the forest environments near you or around your community. Think about what species are playing well with each other. Think about what species are most attractive to the insects nearby. And it's an obvious comment here, but if you're planting species into conditions that are similar to the wild habitats, they'll live longer and they'll be easier to manage. This is why, by the way, from a plant, when you're sourcing plants, when you're trying to source plants from the nursery, ask about their provenance. We typically don't encourage you to purchase plants that have been bred more than 1 county away. Think about that, more than 1 county away. So when you go down to Home Depot and you're buying something at Home Depot, you have no idea where that plant was grown. You have no idea what you're introducing into your environment and how successful you'll be. So, soil, build healthy soil in all cases. James Cassidy is a lecturer for Oregon State University. He teaches soil science. He's one of the most popular lecturers, at OSU. He has what's the answer to any question about soils? The answer: add organic matter. So it's a tongue-in-cheek comment, but building up our soils is especially important, especially here in Western Washington, where our soils are naturally acidic And I tell you, where I'm sitting here on the Long Beach Peninsula, it's all sand. My house is on a 10,000-year sandbar of the Columbia River. I'd better be thinking about enhancing the soil if I'm going to try to grow anything here. Soil testing, it's a big recommendation. Both OSU, Oregon State University, and WSU have strong recommendations about where to go for your soil test. If you're not sure about your soil and your soil quality, prepare it and send off for a test. It's worth doing every 3 years. Although very few of us as master gardeners really sign up for this. We're very sloppy about this. We apologize. We openly admit our faults here. We need to be soil testing more, because again, with the precipitation we get, think about that. All of our precipitation, all those water soluble nutrients, all the calciums, etc., they leach out. They're leaching through your soil. So your nutrients are leaching with all the precipitation we get. The more we can do to build up our soils organically and to keep our soils at high nutrient content, the better it'll be for all the plants and consequently the birds. Now, big trick, of course, what's going to grow under the feeder? If you could see under my feeder, it's a mucky mess right now, right? Between all the birds, right, that knock all the seeds down, and of course, all the ground birds that forage on those seeds. So what will grow under the feeder? There are some great plant choices about ground covers that will grow well there. So you do not have to look at an unsightly mud sty as I'm looking at under my feeder. So topography. This is an interesting point, by the way, just as a side point. When you're thinking about garden landscapes, think about different levels. Audubon, and I apologize for the misspelling there. It's Audubon, it's not Audubon here, but ground feeding birds, they're attracted to abrupt changes in slope. That's interesting to think about, so introducing containers or other structures to mimic hilly, bermy conditions. This is a picture of a trellis that I have and a couple, this is out of my backyard here. And so a couple of containers placed around some wood structures here create some interesting hiding places and some jumping off points for birds. So interesting from a landscape design standpoint. My final comments on here is you think about empty frames that will be filled with layers of plants. Empty frames to be listed with layers of plants that go up and down, as we talked about. Key point about edges, of course, bird varieties are greatest when 2 or more plant communities meet. Edges. Edges, this is again Ken Beavis of DNR. The most productive habitat, edges. Don't mow or apply pesticides to these incredibly rich environments. Leave these edges alone or enhance them. So I'm talking about, think about an edge. An edge can be the edge of your driveway. The edge can be a sidewalk. The edge can be an edge of your property. At the edge of your property, by the way, a very interesting thing to think about is a hedgerow. I'm not talking about a hedge. I'm talking about a hedgerow, a mixed assortment of shrubs and trees and low grasses. Again, thinking layers, ground covers, shrubs, and different canopy layers. But I'm thinking about different hedgerows that could have a very interesting variety of grasses and ground covers at the bottom and other shrubs and fruit-bearing trees at upper levels. And of course, tidiness. Messy ecosystems, orderly frames. Think messy ecosystems, orderly frames. Highly functioning ecosystems can appear messy. Key point here, what's often good in terms of ecosystem functions is often disorderly looking. What's neat and tidy is not sustainable. So your English garden look is not the most productive ecosystem habitat for birds and wildlife. Now you can use this. Now think about this. Here's some great ideas, by the way. Cues to care. Keep your landscapes wild and messy, but you can have a well-cultivated path. So even if you can minimize your lawn, so look at the picture in the lower right there, in which you have a well-mowed lawnscape going through wild areas of trees and shrubs. And it's some very interesting, what you can do with wildflowers and other different layers and very attractive landscapes that don't have to be pristine. And this, by the way, comes back to the article I mentioned earlier. Today's New York Times, the print edition of today's New York Times, A Smarter Fall Cleanup by Margaret Roach. She talks about, hey, let's be a little messier. Let's be a little messier. You do not need to be overly aggressive. Now, this is great for those of us who don't necessarily like to work outside in pouring rain in the fall. So it's important. So you can claim to your spouse, to your partner, about why you're not out there raking leaves. Well, I'm doing the right thing for the landscape, Now, a key point. So I encourage you, by the way, it's a great article, by the way, and you can pick it up online. Just do a search for a Smarter Fall Cleanup on New York Times. Key point about deadheading, by the way. Here's the key thing at which all of us as master gardeners have to hold ourselves back from. Deadheading, of course, is the common practice of cutting off faded or dead flowers. We're always encouraged to do that to clean up our gardens. There's a strong recommendation here. Let the flowers be. Let those deadheads remain because they provide food. And I've seen, by the way, chickadees and nuthatches go directly into old Shasta daisy heads, and they're plucking out the seeds. They're plucking out insects that have found cover inside those deadheads. So yes, it looks a little messy out there, and it may not be the most attractive from a photogenic standpoint, but I tell you, it becomes a very productive habitat to leave those those plants there. And then finally, of course, in fall pruning, we will soon be ready to go to our fall pruning. See who's living there. See who might be living in those areas before you start chopping around. This leads us to dead stuff and to dead trees. If you're fortunate enough to have enough woods where you have dead trees, let them be. Look at that quote down there at the bottom. When you haul away a tree needlessly, you take away half its life destiny. 96 over 8, look at that, over 85 bird species are cavity nesters. This is a shot of a tree I have on my property. And I tell you this, what you can't see here are the many nuthatches and that are using these woodpecker holes as nesting sites. But look at that, 85 bird species are cavity nesters. You have primary cavity nesters and secondary cavity nesters. The primary cavity nesters are the ones actually that use that right to make the holes, such as the woodpeckers and the flickers. The secondary ones are the ones that use those holes, those nesting holes. So celebrate dead trees. Celebrate the fact that a tree that is dead has a useful purpose that is so important for dozens upon dozens of cavity nesters that we most definitely have here in the Pacific Northwest. So it's encouraged, by the way, if you can create a snag, you can think about creating a snag, actually putting dead trees into your landscape. In fact, this is an interesting point here from Audubon. Look at this thing. One pair of woodpeckers requires at least 4 cavities, 1 for nesting, 2 for their own individual roosting sites, and 1 for the fledglings to roost in.
Wow.
So if you're thinking about this, cavities, right, in our dead trees have a very important purpose. And it's very exciting to, by the way, from a bird watching standpoint, just think about that. If you've got to snag a dead tree, either one that naturally is created or that one that you put in, you've got a built-in bird site, a built-in birding viewpoint. So it has a double benefit, right, from a standpoint of providing habitat for birds and a useful place to watch them. So my final reflections. A great book to have, by the way, is these 2 books by Russell Link. The Landscaping for Wildlife is an old book, 1999. I know that's ancient, in today's world. Living with Wildlife is not much. It's a 2006 book. These are very inexpensive books. Get them off Amazon or get them at the library. You'll find them very readable. They're going to cover a lot of the materials I've been talking about here today. and they're great resources just to have in your home library. I want to close though with 10 key points. 10 key points that Doug Tallamy shared at a lecture in 2019 that he also repeats, by the way, in his most recent books. So if I would encourage you to Doug Tallamy, University of Delaware. He's a very good writer, and his most recent books I believe are a must for any environmentally minded, habitat restorer. First thing he recommends: cut your lawn in half. What can you do to minimize your lawn space? We talked about the importance of lawns and the valueless habitat of lawns. Secondly, remove invasive species. Pretty easy to do, and I think we're pretty conscious about that. Again, a shout out to the weed board. 3, keystone plants. Think about the plants such as willows here in the Pacific Northwest that provide habitat and nurturing environments for hundreds of insect species. Best plants, of course, recommending from Doug Tallamy. Repeating this reminder we saw earlier from Doug Tallamy, which are the best plants to work with. Herbaceous plants, trees, shrubs, right? Again, this chart you can search for it on the web, but of course it'll be in the presentation deck that I'll be sharing here. 4, key point 4, layer your landscape. Think about layers. And by the way, layers make for an interesting landscape. This is a Doug Hinckley landscape in which you're showing water, you're showing sedges down at the bottom, ferns down at the bottom, shrubs going up, pierras going up, into the trees and deciduous landscapes. Of course, we have so much to work with here in the Pacific Northwest, so think layers. Interesting point here. You do not need to leave all those lights on. There's a strong point going on is that if in the cities, if we turned off all the lights at night, we would improve the birds who migrate at night. Most of these birds migrate at night, and they're very much distracted by our night lights. So if you can put sensors on the night lights you have outdoors so as to keep your habitat as dark as possible, that's a positive thing for insects. It's a positive thing for birds. Number 6, plant for specialist pollinators. Remember, we mentioned about how many insects are discriminating foodies. Look at the sunflower bee and the squash bee. Obviously, they depend upon, by their names, right, squash and sunflowers. These are bee species that only feed upon sunflowers and only feed upon squash. And by the way, 90% of all insects are beneficial. I encourage you, do not freak out. These are not the murder hornets here. We're talking about beneficial insects that provide huge value to the landscape. And of course, think about the food value that these larvae have for birds. Number 7, plant natives that bloom through the entire season, March through October. And I tell you, in the Pacific Northwest, we can go even further. So Doug Tallamy, writing from Delaware, of course, is talking about March through October as a growing season. We pretty much can provide blooming plants year round if we think carefully about it. And I encourage you, by the way, Audubon has a great native plant database. At the Audubon site, at Audubon sites, look at that. You can put in your zip code. In your zip code, you will get a phenomenal list of native plants that they recommend. And this is right at Audubon site. And I was just there this morning and at confirming the URL and confirming the site. It's a great resource. That's a new tool, by the way. I wasn't aware of this. They just introduced this over the past year. Entering your zip code, right, and going to town with it. Now, oppose mindless mosquito spraying. I don't know about you, but I grew up in Illinois, in an urban environment in Illinois, and every summer the city would run around with a fogger, mosquito fogger, spraying nasty DDT stuff into the air. And of course, we were all outside as kids playing in it, right? So God knows what we were doing to our lungs and to our healthy environment at that point. Thank God we don't have much of that going on these days, but to the extent that you can avoid mindless mosquito spraying, do so. That ties into number 9, minimize your insecticide use. Think IPM, integrated pest management. There are far better things to do than apply insecticides and pesticides, because even organic insecticides are going to kill some beneficial insects. Cultural methods, choosing the right kind of plants, mechanical methods in terms of weeding and hoeing, biological, just having a mixed environment. It's very interesting, by the way, from an ag, this is the new mentality of permaculture, is realizing that a healthy environment, by having strong native plant colonies in your fields, you will attract insects that prey upon other insects, and you can avoid insecticides and herbicides and a lot of fertilizers simply by having a natural environment upon which to grow your foods. And then finally, this is from an East Coast perspective, join your HOA and change from within. So you may not be a member of a homeowners association, but I tell you, you do have neighbors, and you have city you have city members. You can make a point for connected habitats. You can make a point for practices that support better ecosystem management and better landscaping habitats here. So there's all kinds of things that we can do to better create our environments here. So, with that, my final slide, of course, is landscapes grow only fast as Mother Nature permits. Think long term. Don't recall that what you're building out there in the landscape may take years to fully appreciate. And that, you see that comment, most perennials take 3 years to form a robust, well-established generative. So be patient and think over the course of years with respect to your plant life. With that, you've been very patient over the past nearly 90 minutes we've been going here. The URL, right, where this presentation could be downloaded is here on the screen here. You're welcome to email me too, by the way, wkellyrupp@gmail.com, if there's any questions or follow-up. Any other questions, comments now that you want to share?
I'm curious about alder trees. They didn't appear on the tree list, and of course we live in alder tree territory. Are they as equally beneficial?
They are not. And it's interesting. I asked a local botanist about that, because I also had thought about alders as being a keystone species. And they're very important, by the way, because as we know as master gardeners, they'll grow in virtually anything. So they're nitrogen fixers because of their root structure and the relationship they have with the bacteria that grow around the roots. But they're not nearly as productive as oaks, cherries, or willows. Other questions, comments?
Well, thank you, Kelly. This has been fantastic. I learned so much. In fact, I have for years I've been de-lawning my place, planting bushes and having areas. So I've destroyed half of my front yard, and I'm working on the second half as far as lawn goes. But my question, well, I don't have a question, but I have a big garden space, and I'm not going to garden all that much anymore, just a little bit. And I'm thinking of maybe turning it into a native plant garden. And I'm very excited by your talk and all the references you've got. This is just fantastic. It'll be a new project for sure. So thank you very, very much.
And by the way, yeah, that doesn't have to be hard. I did an experiment this year with buying some native plant seeds, a seed packet just of mixed native plant seeds. And I was very pleased by how productive they were and how much they attracted, by the way, not just insects, but also birds then to prey upon the insects that were there. So taking
annuals or perennials?
I'm hoping that because of the mild climate that we have, I'm hoping that many of these annuals will self-seed and create a perennial garden. But we'll see. Great. I'll have to see. This again, we're all continually experimenting, and I encourage you to experiment with the ecosystems that you have.
Yeah. Well, grass is the biggest problem I have. Grass just seems to overcome any small plant I try to plant. So
I encourage you to think sedges, by the way. There are 169 native sedges here in the Northwest. And sedges
Wow.
are different from grasses, right? So sedges have
Yes,
edges,
yes.
rushes are round, right? You remember that little axiom,
Oh, yeah.
Other questions, comments?
Well done, Kelly. That was excellent. Really, really I learned a lot from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. David.
Yeah, I've got a few lots out here in Ocean Shores, and I've been doing a lot of what you've talked about. Several lots that I bought were cleared for camping years ago, so I've been replanting native trees and different sorts of vegetation. The one issue that comes up out here is deer damage, because we have so many deer out here that, in addition to all the other factors, we have to take that into account to try to at least, and even with trees, to get them to grow big enough. I had one this morning, actually. I was out doing some photographing, and I saw a buck that I wanted to get some shots of, and he started eating on one of the pine trees, which was kind of interesting. And I went to look at it, and he had already rubbed up and down, and it's only about maybe a 4-foot tall pine that I planted last year. So it's another issue to take into account, is what the deer will allow you to plant.
And of course the deer, and of course we have a bear here too, by the way. So we've seen bear climb up in some of my fruit trees, right, and just rip the limbs off entirely. So to that point, that David, I recommend that companion plantings. So if you make it difficult for the deer to get to some of those trees by planting dense foliage like Nootka rose or salal around those trees you want to protect, because the deer will, I mean, they'll go, obviously they'll go where they can. And so by creating a brush pile that they can't walk upon, which is great for bird habitat, as you know, next to trees or plants that you want to grow to, I also create some selective fencing. I have a shade garden that the deer had used to just traverse right through, and they would just browse through all the specialty ferns that I was trying to grow. I discovered that all I had to do was just put a few fence areas. I didn't have to completely close the garden, just put some fencing to dissuade the deer from wandering through that path. And I was very successful then in keeping them away from those areas.
I've done some things with what I call horizontal fencing, where I take branches. I drag a lot of branches off even the beach, and I crisscross them around areas where I want to protect plants. And I have found that if I do enough of it, it will dissuade deer and elk from walking through areas where I've got other plants. I found that's been really effective, and it doesn't have to look as funny as it sounds. It can actually look pretty good, and the plants fluff out inside the grid that I make with the branches, and it really does do a pretty good job of keeping the deer and elk out of areas.
Excellent idea. And of course, again, those the brush piles again are great habitat. They're great hiding places. You can put a watering, putting a water feature underneath or inside of that branching area, and it creates a whole different landscape for birds.
That's a good idea.
Other thoughts? What have we inspired you to do? What is there one thing that you've taken away from today that you talked about, turning over part of making a pollinator garden, for example, or a wildflower garden in your garden area? What else is some of you thought about today based upon what we've talked about?
I was pleased about your talking about not having to deadhead because I'm terrible at it. And everybody said, oh, you must, but I'm happy to hear I don't necessarily have to.
And you can give them a reason. You can tell them it's not just because I'm lazy, right? It's
Right,
because
That's right. That's the key.
Well, I think I'm going to mow less of the remainder of my lawn next summer, and just mow a strip leading up to the house or something. That'll save some work too.
You'll see in that New York Times article, they talk about edge mowing. So at the Cornell Ornithology Lab, they practice what they call edge mowing. And so what they do is that they'll only mow a path and they leave their edges as rough and wild as possible.
All right. I like that.
So it looks tidy enough, so Robin, you had a question.
Oh, well, I had a lot of willows growing in my back, and I felt bad about them just going all wild. Now I don't feel bad about them.
There you go. Celebrate the willows. I agree with you. I was thinking about taking willows out, so as to improve, so I thought, the land. And then I realized that, oh my goodness, that's the last thing I want to do. I want to celebrate those willows.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I have been trying to establish a wild look, and I get such negative feedback from so many people. And it's, like they'll say, you want me to take down that dead limb for you? Or I know a really good landscaper that could mow your lawn for you. And so there's a big, we've got to get this information out loud and clear, because there is such a premium on a aesthetic appeal of a sterile environment.
That is so true. And the social pressures we are often on, including in some homeowners associations, right, to maintain a very tidy landscape, right? So it is important to talk about these issues. And the point is that what we're talking about here today, there are books that cover this. So everything I've talked about here today is from a reference. There's very little original work here, right? This is all, I encourage you to read Doug Tallamy, read Hill. There's some great texts that are out there.
Yeah, but how do we get a reconciliated environment to be more acceptable to the greater population? So
go back to the slides I was talking about in terms of add some structure or some hardscape. If you look like you're intentionally planning that, i.e. Keep a well-maintained path and a well-maintained look only on part of your lawn, so that it's very clear that it's not just because you're entirely lazy or that you just don't care. You're intentionally doing something. And in fact, going back to Terry's point about placing the driftwood and creating that woody habitat, if you put a bird bath in there, if you could add some hardscape or a planter so that it's clear to an observer that you want that look to be there. Either a bird bath or through a very custom design. You can put art. There's great artwork, by the way, to put out there. Public artwork that could be quite attractive.
Kelly, we have a lot of wetlands and we have some yellow flag that has been there for a long time and we keep working at it. Do you have any suggestions? I mean, it's very difficult to get rid of.
Yellow flagged iris is a nasty, noxious weed, and you will find that weed if you're going to do a search on Washington Noxious Weed Board, right? You'll find that plant listed there. Now, because that noxious weed is in the wetland, it may be very difficult to dig out. And this is a case in which a very specific application of a water herbicide may be required. And this is, again, your conservation district can help you with this. The Noxious Weed Board, calling the Noxious Weed Board, they can talk about this as well, because there are some very specific applications that, if done very carefully, can take out the yellow flagged iris.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions, other comments, other inspiration? After all, we're all at home, so there's plenty of time to be doing things around the house, right?
Right. Well, we have only one. I wanted to ask you about oaks. I love oak trees. I'm from the East, and they have like 20 different kinds of oak trees there. And we have one native oak tree in Washington. So I have planted, just for nostalgic purposes, I've planted a couple of eastern oaks. Now, are the eastern oaks out here useful in insect production for the birds?
That's a very good question. The answer is I don't know exactly, but there are, as you point out, Quercus garryana, right? You know, the Oregon white oak is our
Right.
only native oak. And by the
Right.
way, there's a in the near Olympia, by the way, there's a whole plains. It's an Olympia Plains preserve, I believe, that they're trying to restore huge acreages of that shrubby oak. To your point, I would encourage you, even if you have a different kind of oak, keep growing it. Because I tell you, guess what? There's the acorn woodpecker. The acorn woodpecker is a beautiful woodpecker. It's a big woodpecker, by the way, with this brilliant yellow chest, brilliant, beautiful yellow chest. And I'm so pleased to have recorded the only sighting in Pacific County of an acorn woodpecker a few years
Wow.
ago when there was a drought in the Willamette Valley that displaced a lot of woodpeckers. So this poor woodpecker is trying to find acorns on my coastal property. And I felt badly for it because I couldn't talk to it and say, no, don't go here. I can't help you. But I know there was a few oaks a few miles north. Just go a little bit north. By the way, this also speaks to the fact that the Audubon is very concerned about the wildfires. The wildfires in Oregon and California have diminished a lot of habitat for migrating birds. So there's a lot of concern this year and obviously into the future about that less habitat that's going to be available for them. All the more reason for us doing what we can here to improve our ecosystems, right, for the birds.
Right. Right. Well, this has been a fabulous talk. We have all learned so much. And thank you so much, Kelly, for sparing your time, for taking the time to prepare it and for naming it, putting our name in the